Disclaimer: this story contains mature themes intended for adult viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. The night air on that balcony felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the summer heat, not because the city lights flickered below like restless fireflies, but because three people stood there, tangled in a silence that carried too many unspoken things. I remember the exact moment everything shifted. It started with a look, not the casual kind you exchange with a stranger across a crowded room, but the kind that lingers half a second too long, the kind that makes your chest tighten before your mind even understands why. His eyes held mine with a quiet intensity that felt almost dangerous, as if we had stepped into a conversation neither of us had agreed to start. The balcony was narrow, barely wide enough for two people to stand comfortably, yet somehow we were all there. The city breathed below us, distant traffic, faint music from somewhere down the street, the warm glow of apartment windows stacked like tiny lives unfolding behind glass. And then there was him, too close, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence without him even touching me, close enough that every movement seemed deliberate, every breath measured. There was something reckless in the way he stood there, like a man who knew the line he shouldn't cross, and was already imagining what it would feel like if he did. I should have stepped away. I should have said something light, something normal, something that would break the strange tension curling through the air, but I didn't. Because there was something in his gaze that made the world around us fade slightly, like the balcony had become its own small universe where time slowed down and choices suddenly felt heavier. Behind us, leaning against the railing, my husband watched. He didn't interrupt, he didn't move. At first it seemed like he was simply enjoying the quiet evening, taking in the skyline the way he always did when the city settled into night. But there was a tightness in his posture, subtle, almost invisible, that hinted he understood more than anyone was saying aloud. Maybe he saw the way my breath caught. Maybe he noticed the way the silence stretched between us, thick and fragile. Or maybe he felt it too, that strange pull in the air, like a storm waiting just beyond the horizon. The man in front of me smiled slightly, but it wasn't a careless smile. It was slow, deliberate, as if he understood exactly how dangerous the moment had become. His voice when he finally spoke was low and calm. Funny how a small space can suddenly feel so crowded. The words were simple, yet something about them made my heart beat faster. Because he wasn't talking about the balcony, he was talking about us, about the things we weren't saying, about the tension pressing closer with every passing second. I glanced back toward the railing, toward the man who had shared years of my life, the man who knew the rhythm of my thoughts better than anyone else. His eyes met mine for just a moment, steady, unreadable, and in that moment something shifted again. No one stepped forward, no one stepped back, but the distance between us suddenly felt like the most dangerous space in the world. Because everyone on that balcony understood one thing at the exact same time. Some lines, once crossed, change everything. And the night had only just begun. The silence lingered longer than it should have. No one moved, yet everything felt like it was shifting beneath the surface. The man standing in front of me rested one hand lightly on the balcony wall beside my shoulder, not touching me, not quite, but close enough that the warmth of his arm brushed the air between us. The narrow space suddenly felt even smaller, as if the night itself had leaned closer to watch what would happen next. "You're quiet," he said softly. His voice wasn't teasing, it was careful, curious. I let out a slow breath, trying to steady the rhythm of my heartbeat. "It's a small balcony," I replied. "There's not much room for big conversations." His lips curved slightly at that. "Sometimes small spaces are where the biggest things happen." The words hung between us like a spark that hadn't decided whether to ignite. I felt it again, that strange pull in my chest. The one that made me forget, just for a moment, that someone else was standing only a few feet away. Behind us, my husband shifted his weight against the railing. The faint scrape of his shoe against the concrete broke the moment just enough to remind me that none of this existed in isolation. Three people, one narrow balcony, and far too many emotions crowding the space. I glanced back over my shoulder. The city lights reflected in my husband's eyes, making it hard to read what he was thinking. His arms were folded loosely, but his jaw remained tight, as if he was holding back words he hadn't yet decided to speak. When I turned back, the man in front of me was watching me even more closely now. "Are you always this guarded?" he asked quietly. The question caught me off guard. "Am I? You look like someone who's fighting a conversation in her own head." I let out a small laugh, though it felt more like an exhale of nerves than amusement. "You read people too easily." "Not easily," he said, "just carefully." A soft breeze moved across the balcony, brushing strands of my hair across my cheek. Without thinking, I lifted my hand to tuck them back, but at the same moment he reached out too. Our fingers brushed. It was the smallest contact imaginable, barely a touch, Yet the reaction was immediate. A quiet jolt traveled up my arm, as if the simple meeting of skin carried more meaning than it should have. For a second neither of us pulled away. The world below continued moving, cars sliding through streets, distant laughter drifting upward. But up here everything felt suspended in slow motion. His hand withdrew first, not abruptly, just slowly enough that the absence of warmth felt noticeable. "Sorry," he murmured, but his eyes said something very different. They said he hadn't meant it as a mistake. Behind us my husband spoke for the first time since the conversation began. "You two look like you're solving the mysteries of the universe over there." His voice carried a calm tone, but there was an edge beneath it. I turned slightly toward him. "We're just talking." Looks intense for just talking. The man beside me leaned back slightly against the wall now, giving the space between us a little more air, though the tension didn't fade. "If it helps," he said lightly toward my husband, "I don't think we've solved anything yet." My husband's gaze moved between us. Then he gave a small, unreadable smile. "Good," he said, "because some mysteries are better left unsolved." The words landed softly, but their meaning echoed through the narrow balcony like distant thunder. For a moment none of us spoke again. The night breeze moved between us. The city glowed below. And somehow the silence felt even more dangerous than before, because now everyone knew the tension was real. No one was pretending otherwise anymore. The quiet that followed seemed to stretch across the balcony like a thin wire pulled too tight. No one spoke, yet the air felt crowded with things no one dared say. I turned slightly toward the city, letting my hands rest on the cool metal railing. The skyline glittered beneath the dark sky, each window glowing with someone else's life, someone else's story. For a moment I focused on that view, trying to slow the restless rhythm in my chest. But even without looking at him I knew he hadn't moved. I could still feel his presence beside me, close enough that the space between us felt deliberate. "Beautiful view," he said quietly. His voice had softened. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my eyes on the horizon. "It almost makes the city look peaceful." Almost. That single word held a strange weight, like he understood that peace was the one thing none of us had on this balcony tonight. Behind us my husband exhaled slowly. "You two always this intense when you talk?" he asked. The question sounded casual, but there was a sharpness behind it. I glanced back. He was still leaning against the railing, but his gaze had sharpened, observant, patient, like someone studying a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. The man beside me gave a small shrug. "Maybe the balcony does that." "Or maybe," my husband replied, "people reveal more when they think no one's paying attention." His words settled over the three of us. For a moment the city noise below seemed louder. Distant engines, faint laughter from somewhere down the street, life moving normally while our small corner of the world felt suspended in something fragile. I turned back again, but this time the man beside me stepped closer to the railing too, not close enough to touch, just close enough that our shoulders nearly aligned. "You ever feel like life pushes people into strange moments?" he asked quietly. I glanced at him. "What kind of moments?" "The kind where everything feels obvious." His eyes met mine, even when no one says it out loud. My pulse skipped. The honesty in his voice made it hard to pretend we were discussing anything ordinary. I swallowed lightly. "And what do you do in those moments?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze drifted briefly toward my lips. Subtle, almost accidental. Before returning to my eyes, the silence stretched again. For a fraction of a second it felt like the world leaned closer. He moved just slightly, not enough to cross any line, but enough that the distance between us suddenly felt very small. My breath caught. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't even visible, but something in my chest tightened as if the moment had weight. Then reality pressed back in, behind us. Watching, knowing. I stepped away first, only half a step, but it was enough. The cool air rushed into the space between us, breaking the fragile pull that had almost formed. He noticed. Of course he noticed, but he didn't look offended. If anything, there was a quiet understanding in his expression, like he knew exactly why I had done it. "Some moments," he said softly, finishing his earlier thought, "are dangerous." I let out a breath that felt heavier than it should. Dangerous how? Because once you step into them, his voice lowered slightly, you can't pretend they never happened. Behind us my husband shifted again, not impatient, just present. A reminder that the world was still bigger than the charged silence on this narrow balcony. I looked back toward the city lights, trying to steady my thoughts, but the truth lingered like heat under my skin. Nothing had happened, no lines had been crossed, yet somehow everything already felt different. And the most dangerous part was this: no one seemed ready to walk away. The balcony felt smaller than ever, not physically, the same narrow stretch of concrete, the same metal railing cool beneath the night air, but emotionally, as if the space between us had been quietly shrinking with every passing minute. No one spoke. Yet something in the silence had changed. The city lights below shimmered like scattered diamonds, and the faint hum of traffic floated upward through the warm night. But those distant sounds felt far away now, like another world continuing without us. Here everything seemed to revolve around the inches between two people who both knew exactly what was happening, and neither of them was brave enough to say it. I rested my hands lightly on the railing, trying to focus on the skyline again, but my awareness kept drifting back beside me, to the quiet presence standing close enough that I could feel the subtle warmth of his shoulder through the thin space between us. He hadn't moved away after I stepped back earlier. If anything, he seemed even more still now. "Do you feel that?" he asked suddenly. His voice was soft, almost careful. I turned slightly toward him. "Feel what?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes searched mine, slowly, thoughtfully, like someone trying to decide how honest he was willing to be. "This," he finally said. The word hovered between us. I knew what he meant, of course I did, but saying it aloud felt like opening a door neither of us would be able to close again, so I stayed quiet. Behind us, my husband remained near the railing, watching the city as if he had no interest in the conversation unfolding only a few feet away. Yet the stillness in his posture suggested he heard more than he let on. The man beside me shifted slightly, turning his body toward mine, not touching, just closer. Close enough that the electric tension returned instantly, that quiet charge that seemed to live in the space between our breaths. "You know what the hardest part is," he murmured. "What?" "Pretending I don't notice the way you look at me." My heart stumbled. The honesty in his voice struck deeper than I expected. "I don't," I began, but the words faded before they could form, because the truth was already there in the silence between us. His gaze softened slightly. "I'm not imagining it," he said quietly. It wasn't a question, it was a confession. The night breeze lifted a strand of my hair again, brushing it across my cheek. For a moment I didn't move, and then, slowly, he reached up. His fingers paused just short of my face, as if waiting, asking. The moment stretched so thin it felt fragile. I could hear my heart beat, feel the weight of the choice hanging in the air. If I leaned even slightly closer, the space between us would disappear. If I stayed still, the moment might pass. His fingertips finally brushed the loose strand of hair away from my cheek. The touch was barely there, light, careful. Yet the contact sent a quiet shiver through me that I couldn't hide. His hand lingered a second longer than necessary. And for the briefest instant our eyes locked with a kind of honesty neither of us had allowed before. Raw, unfiltered, dangerous. Behind us my husband shifted his stance. The sound snapped through the fragile moment like a thread pulled too tight. Neither of us moved. But the world suddenly felt very aware of us again. The man's hand lowered slowly. Our faces were still close. Too close. His voice dropped to a whisper. "If things were different." The unfinished sentence hung between us. Heavy. Alive. Neither of us finished it, because we both already knew how it would end, and for one suspended heartbeat beneath the city lights, it felt like we might forget why we. Rain fell softly against the balcony, a gentle percussion that seemed to echo every thought and feeling neither of us had voiced until now. The city lights shimmered through the droplets, turning the skyline into a blur of gold and silver that felt like it existed just for us. The narrow space around us disappeared, leaving only the two of us suspended in a quiet storm of emotion. I could feel him before I even saw him fully. The warmth of his presence brushed against mine, unspoken but undeniable. Our hands hovered close, almost touching, as if the air itself had grown thick enough to carry the weight of our desire. The rain kissed our skin, and somehow it felt intimate, a shared secret between us and the night. Her breath melted into his, or maybe it was his into hers. The distinction didn't matter anymore. Every exhale carried the words we had been holding back for weeks, months, years. Our eyes spoke the confessions our mouths could not, and when our shoulders brushed, even that small contact sent tremors through the space between us, a silent acknowledgement that everything had changed. The man's hand lingered near hers, not daring to close the distance too quickly, yet present enough that the electricity in the air pulsed stronger. They didn't need to speak. Their bodies spoke the words they couldn't say. Each heartbeat, each quiet intake of breath, became a language all its own. The rain intensified slightly, tapping against the balcony like a delicate drum roll, and the soft sound wrapped around them like a cocoon. She leaned in just a fraction, letting the closeness speak for her. The moment wasn't loud, wasn't rushed. It was deliberate, patient, exquisite. Every inch of space between them became charged, every quiet glance a spark. He exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he had carried too long. She felt it in her chest, a gentle weight lifted. The city, the distance, the complications, they all faded. Nothing existed but the sound of the rain, the shimmer of light on wet concrete, and the quiet, steady connection between their hearts. For one perfect stretch of time, the world was suspended. The night wrapped around them in a soft embrace, wind lifting strands of hair, rain cooling heated skin, and every tiny contact, the brush of hands, the grazing of shoulders, resonated deeper than words ever could. They moved closer, tentatively at first, savoring the slow crescendo of intimacy, and then for just a heartbeat, everything aligned. It wasn't about what happened or what could happen. It wasn't about boundaries or consequences. It was about the raw, magnetic closeness they had fought to deny, finally allowed to breathe, finally permitted to exist without fear. And in that moment, even the city seemed to pause, as if it too had been holding its breath. They stayed there, skin to skin in spirit, if not fully in touch, drenched in rain and light and longing. Every subtle motion, every shared gaze, every soft inhalation carried the intensity of the culmination of weeks of restraint. They hadn't crossed a line yet, but in their hearts the line no longer mattered. They had let go. The night didn't rush them, it held them, quiet and infinite, leaving the anticipation lingering like an echo in the rain-soaked air, leaving the story poised on the edge of everything yet to come. The morning light filtered softly through the thin curtains, pale and quiet, brushing across the narrow apartment balcony where the night's storm had left its mark. The air smelled faintly of rain and city, of wet concrete and fleeting warmth. Everything felt altered, though nothing in the room had changed. She sat on the edge of the balcony railing, knees pulled close, hands wrapped around them as if holding herself together. The night's electricity had faded, replaced by a lingering weight that pressed on her chest. Every memory from hours ago played back in fragments, soft touches, whispered words, the way his presence had felt like gravity itself. But with it came the shadows, guilt, doubt, and the quiet realization that choices had consequences even when nothing was done explicitly. He stood a few feet away, leaning lightly against the railing, staring down at the wet street below. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes betrayed the same unrest she felt. They hadn't spoken much since the rain stopped. Words seemed unnecessary and impossible all at once. Instead, they existed in shared silence, letting the city's muted hum carry the tension. The distance between them felt heavier than it had the night before. Yet there was an unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted, irrevocably. Something delicate had been discovered between them, a closeness that neither could deny but neither dared name. "I keep thinking," she began softly, her voice hesitant. "Maybe last night, maybe it was just the rain and the dark." He didn't turn to her immediately. When he finally did, his gaze held hers for a long moment, not with accusation, not with expectation, but with the weight of understanding. "Maybe," he said quietly, "or maybe it was exactly what it felt like." The words lingered, impossible to untangle. She exhaled slowly, letting the early light warm her skin. There was comfort in that honesty, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it hurt. Behind them the city moved on. A delivery truck rattled past. A cafe somewhere opened its doors and the soft scent of fresh bread wafted through the open window. Life continued. Then, just as she began to allow herself the fragile calm of morning, the door clicked. Her husband stepped out onto the balcony, coffee cup in hand. His presence was ordinary, almost mundane, yet it held a quiet gravity. He didn't speak immediately, but the way he looked at them, at the faint traces of the night's closeness still hanging in the air, suggested he knew more than either of them expected. The tension shifted again, subtle, but undeniable. The morning was no longer just about reflection. It was about reality. Decisions, consequences, and truth had arrived with the soft dawn. She swallowed, brushing a stray wet hair from her face, her eyes meeting his, not hers, not the other man's but his. A flicker of something unspoken passed between them, a silent understanding that love, longing, guilt, and connection could coexist. And maybe, just maybe, the night had not broken them but revealed something deeper, more human, in all three hearts. The city continued below, indifferent and sprawling, but on that small balcony the city had finally woken, soft morning light spilling across the balcony where the night's storm had faded into memory. The air smelled of rain, warm concrete, and the faint trace of incense from an open apartment window. Every drop of water that lingered on the railing seemed to hold a story. The story of hearts that had stretched to their edges and then slowly, gently returned. She leaned back against the railing, the cool metal grounding her. The rain had washed away the night's intensity, but it hadn't erased the connection, the quiet electricity that still lingered. Her hands rested loosely in her lap as she watched the city awaken, each passing moment softening the edges of what had been a storm within. He approached slowly, careful, not because she had asked him to, not because there was fear, but because the space between them now required patience, respect, and tenderness. The closeness that had once been dangerous was now safe, not in spite of the past, but because of it. Without words, she felt him settle beside her. His presence was steady, comforting, a promise unspoken but felt deep in the chest. Fingers brushed, accidental, deliberate, neither entirely, and the simple contact spoke louder than anything they could say aloud. Her husband appeared at the doorway again, coffee cup in hand, but the tension that had gripped the night before had softened into something almost serene. He smiled faintly, a small acknowledgement that while nothing could be undone, life moved forward. The three of them shared a quiet space, no need for conversation. Every glance, every subtle movement held understanding. She exhaled slowly, tilting her head. He leaned toward her, and this time the touch was deliberate, gentle. A hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a forehead brushing against hers. No words were needed. Their hearts had chosen, if not in grand declarations then in quiet mutual acknowledgement of all that had passed. The city buzzed faintly below, indifferent to the delicate human stories unfolding above, and yet in that suspended morning everything felt monumental. The storm had passed, and what remained was warmth, clarity, and the kind of intimacy that doesn't shout but resonates like a heartbeat. They didn't speak of what came next. That would wait. For now it was enough to breathe, to exist together in silence, to let the closeness fill the space around them. A kiss to the forehead, a hand held briefly, a shared glance, all that was left unsaid, yet fully understood. And as the sun rose higher, spilling golden light over wet concrete and glass, she felt a calm she hadn't known she could have. The night had tested them, pulled them to edges they hadn't known existed, and yet here they were, alive, human and deeply undeniably connected. Some stories linger like perfume. Some nights leave marks on the soul. This one did both, leaving goosebumps and quiet warmth in its wake.